not say anything at the outset here, that I agree with the Reverend. Anyways, never mind.
Great to have you here. All right, so we're going to jump right in, and I believe Reverend Dr. Liz Harris, you're going to start it off, or Bishop Barber, actually. Oh, I'm sorry, you have an opening statement. I just violated my own rule. 4 minutes for you, Mr. Vice President.
I thought I made a mistake.
Yes.
All right.
You have 4 minutes.
4 minutes. So count getting to the podium. Hey, everybody, thank you for being here. Thank you. Reverend Barber, good to see you again. Look, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Joe Biden. I'm Joe Biden's husband, and today's my anniversary. And she's still with me, so God love her. And I'm the father of Ashley Biden, who runs the Delaware Center for Justice for a long time, and my son Hunter, who was the head of the World Food Program USA for years. And folks, look, I'm honored to be here today in the Poor People's Campaign, and that's just what it is. Reverend Barber, you and I have talked about this before, but the fact of the matter is what you're doing really make a difference. You are, in fact, picking up where it was left off by Dr. King, when in fact he decided that it was necessary to go beyond just poverty among African Americans, but across the nation. Because for too many years, the animating principle of what's happened is that with great income inequality, what's happened is the charlatans have been able to pit black folks against white folks, against Latino, etc. And because if you have a problem, it's the other. Look what's happening now. The reason why the poor folks are poor is because of all those immigrants, all those Muslims, all those African Americans, etc. It's a bunch of malarkey. And the fact of the matter is that the People Campaign intends to end this exploitation. And the exploitation is more extreme than it's ever been because of the gigantic income inequality that exists here in America. It's greater than any time since the turn of the last century. Reverend, it's not only that we have less than half the people in the almost half the people in the United States living in poverty. It's ridiculous that we have this extreme change that's going on. Deep inequities in our society. Our policy discriminates against and devalues black people, Native Americans, people of color, women, LGBTQ individuals, people with disabilities. I'm going quick because I have 4 minutes. Refugees, immigrants, asylum seekers. And look, they talk about our children. These aren't somebody else's children. They're all our children. They're all our children. They are the kite strings that literally lift our national ambitions aloft. So you can't say it's their children. They're America's children. And we have an obligation. And every single one of them should be treated with dignity. You know, as you know, today is the 4th anniversary of the massacre of Mother Emanuel Church down in Charleston. And the fact of the matter is that Reverend Pinckney was a friend, and he was murdered along with 8 other parishioners. But it was ultimately a show of hate, the clearest example of the poisonous ideology of white supremacy. But here's the point: in fact, when we went down there after to celebrate the loss of those people and their lives, President Obama stood there and he ended his presentation with "Amazing Grace." And it's amazing the impact it had. I got to stay afterwards the next day. My family and I went to the regular service. And I listened to I met every one of those family members. And they forgave. They had the grace to forgive those who did the horrible things that were done. And they put enormous pressure.
That is your time, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great being with you.
All right. So come and sit on down. No, come back. Sit on down. All right, Bishop Barber, if you have a question.
Let me ask this question. The Poor People's Campaign is building a movement to root out the interlocking injustices of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and the war and what we call the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. Vice President Biden, I'm from the South, the Sun Belt, where 1/3 of all the poor people live in America. That's 50 million people. 13 million of them are uninsured. And the southern states, along with some other states, 26 of them to be exact, have the worst records on voter suppression and racialized gerrymandering. But here's the other side. The persons who get elected by what some courts have now called surgical racism, once in office, they vote to deny health care, living wages, cut public education, deny women's rights, immigrants' rights, LGBTQ rights in ways that hurt in raw numbers more low-wealth white people. There are 26 million poor low-wealth blacks and 66 million poor low-wealth whites in this country. Here's the question. When will you go and spend significant time in the South and the Sun Belt to put a spotlight on these issues? How will you fight to win a new electorate of poor whites, blacks, Latinos, natives, rather than write off the South and the Sun Belt? And lastly, how will your campaign and administration address the issues of poverty, low wealth, health care, low wages in a way that undermines the myth that these issues impact small, marginalized groups of people only, rather than all of us?
First of all, I plan on campaigning in the South. I plan, if I'm your nominee, winning Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, believe it or not. And I believe we can win Texas and Florida, if you look at the polling data now. Doesn't mean it's a marathon. It's a long way off. If you may recall, Reverend, I'm the only person who went in and campaigned in the off-year election for the senator in Alabama. I was the only person invited down there to speak. Not the only, but I was the only one who wasn't a person of color that was invited down. I spent a lot of time campaigning in North Carolina and Texas and around the country. I have no intention of walking away if I'm the nominee, and if I'm not nominee, I have no intention of walking away and trying to help whoever the nominee is to win those states, number one. Number two, as President of the United States, were I to be elected, I would make sure a number of things happen. Number one, we have to bring back what happened with the Voting Rights Act, as you well know, when there was a decision, the Shelby County case occurred. And it said that it's going to eliminate the requirement of you have to get pre-clearance to change anything dealing with your voting rights legislation, anything that changes. The truth of the matter is, I thought we had made real progress. I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, or the ranking member, when we extended the Voting Rights Act the last time for 25 years. It was a 5-year increment. I was there and did it for 25 years. And at the time that happened, we had a unanimous vote, 98-0. All those Southern boys and women voted for it. They went, I thought maybe there's progress. Maybe things are beginning to change. But what I vastly underestimated was how deep and systemic the racism is, and why, in fact, it never gives up. It's like cutting grass. You got to do it every week. You let it go for a month or 6 months or a year, you got a forest in the middle of your yard. And so I would do my best to get a United States Senate, the Democratic Senate again, and reinsert the Voting Rights Act and overrule the Shelby case as a practical matter. That would change things dramatically. With regard to everything from education to the prison system, I think everyone's entitled to have total health care. And what I would do is make sure that every single person, as I propose, every single person in the United States has access to Medicaid right off the bat. I would triple the number of the amount of money we spend on Title I for underprivileged schools, from $15 to $45 billion a year. And I would make sure that we had preschool for 3 and 4 or 5-year-olds in every single state and union. I would make sure that we're in a situation where we had more social workers and more school psychiatrists, etc., going into those schools, because guess what happens? It's a long question. It's an essay, okay? You're looking at me like you want me to stop. You want me to answer any more, or want me to stop? Okay, she's the moderator. Well, anyway, let me conclude by saying, look, folks, there isn't a single reason in the world why every single solitary child in America is not covered by health insurance. There isn't a single reason in the world why any parent having to pay for daycare should in fact not have a $8,000 tax credit. I was a single parent for 5 years after my wife and daughter were killed and my sons were badly injured. And I had a lot of help. And I had the salary of a senator then at $42,000. And I found it hard. I can only imagine what it is for single parents trying to raise a child on a minimum wage. We have to raise the minimum wage to a minimum of $15 an hour. It's disgraceful that someone works 40 hours a week and lives in poverty. There's a whole lot of other things I could speak to, but the bottom line is, I think your budget, my dad had an expression. He'd say, someone come to my dad and say, let me tell you what I value, Joe. He said, don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget. I will tell you what you value. These guys don't value education. They don't value the poor. They don't value any of the things we're talking about right now.
Let's have Reverend Theo Harris ask a question.
Great. So the Poor People's Campaign has done an audit, and we found that there's 140 million people who are poor or one couple $100 emergency from deep poverty. We want to know, even though there's so many folks, 43.5% of the population, the media doesn't cover it. Most politicians don't talk about it. People prefer to talk about the middle class. And then when we're told is that there's not enough to go around, even though they can find 53 cents of every discretionary dollar for the military. So we have a three-part question. One, what are you going to say about this lie of scarcity? Two, how are we going to immediately and fully, not incrementally, eliminate poverty? And three, what can you say about your view on military spending and the militarization and the problem of warmongering that's happening in this country and world?
Number one, we have the greatest income inequity in the history of the United States of America since 1902. And the fact of the matter is, there is plenty of money to go around. The first thing I would do as president was eliminate the president's tax cut, which added to the deficit $2 trillion. And also we now have $1,600 billion in tax expenditures. Fancy word for saying loopholes. You cannot justify over $1 trillion of that. And so we have the money. And what we should do I'll give you an example. It's not just, we're not talking about the middle class. We talk about the poor because they have to have access to be able to get into a place where, in fact, they can live a decent life. Everyone's entitled to be treated with dignity. And you have no dignity when you cannot provide health care for your children. You have no dignity when you turn around and look at a talented child and realize there's nothing you can do to help them get an education. You have no dignity. So my point is that as a United States Senator, and then more importantly 8 years as Vice President, we moved to cut the budget, if you'll recall. I'm the guy the president put in charge of ending our presence in Iraq we had over 160,000 troops overseas when we took over, and the president said to me, what are we going to do? We moved them down. We're now down to 1/5 of that amount of people involved. We should not be involved in a war in Yemen. We should not be surprised. So there's so many things that we can do in terms of the military budget, but also, folks, remember, there is $1,600 billion in loopholes. Give you one example. We could make sure every single solitary person in the United States qualified to go to a community college if we have a good education system for preschool through 12. We could put them all of them free into community college who are qualified for $6 billion a year. There goes that big spending Democrat, right? Well, guess what? Eliminate one loophole. It's called stepped-up basis, because I was listening to the poorest man in Congress for 30-some years. I didn't even know what it was. Stepped-up basis means you have a capital gain, you go out and buy $1 million worth of stock, and you end up selling it for $2 million. You got to pay a capital gain, but God forbid you get hit by a truck on the way to sell it. It gets left to your daughter or son. They pay no tax. That means $17 billion less collected every year. You can put every single solitary child qualified community college, cutting in half the cost of college, giving them opportunities that go well beyond anything that exists now, and I can do it and still have $11 billion left over. It's one little tiny illustration of the ability we have to do so much. The idea we cannot triple money for the Title I. The idea we cannot provide an $8,000 tax credit for any man, woman who is in fact needs it for child care, etc. So this is all within our wheelhouse, and we don't have to punish anybody. This isn't about punishment. You take away $500 billion of these loopholes, you're not going to affect any wealthy person's standard of living, for God's sake. They're not going to have to sell their second or fifth or 15th home, whatever the devil it is. This is just plain fairness, simple, basic fairness, and we have all the money we need to do it.
All right, Mr. Vice President, I'm going to bring up Francine Jefferson. Where is Francine? All right, Francine, ask your question.
Good afternoon, Vice President Biden. Thank you for taking this question. My name is Francine Jefferson. I'm here with Pastor Finch, who's from rural Indiana. In fact, he lives on the banks of the Ohio River, which is the most contaminated river in the country. I and some of my family members and friends are here from Mississippi, from the floodlands of the Mississippi Delta, where Dr. King first launched the Poor People's Campaign 51 years ago. So I'm coming from a place called Chula, Mississippi, Holmes County, which is the poorest county in the nation. Recently, we had a flood that destroyed homes and fields, left the crops devastated, and we've seen almost no governmental help. Now, it's not uncommon for us to be ignored. Again, we've held the title of the poorest county in the nation for a long time. But the truth be told, we're living in the richest nation in the world, and we are the poorest county. There are a lot of places like this all over the nation, and we're experiencing real national emergency. My question, Mr. Biden, is, well, first of all, to say to you that poverty hurts. High poverty in the United States is the wrong thing. It's morally corrupt. But it is fixable, and my question is this: how will your administration respond to the increased threats of national disasters, emergencies from climate change, and the connection to the ever-present emergency of poverty across this country?
In the interest of time, I've laid out in detail a global warming initiative but focusing first and foremost on what we do with those communities that are the poorest communities that are hit the worst by environmental degradation. Whether it is flooding, whether it's being in the shadow of a smokestack, whether it's lead paint in the wall, whether or not you can't turn on a faucet without drinking poison water, that would be the first and foremost focus immediately what happens as we move towards zero emission. Number one. Number two, the whole idea that, in fact, we think that the global warming that's occurring and having this phenomenal impact on the United States of America and the world is a consequence of it hurts everyone equally. It does long run, but in the near term, it's a gigantic unfairness to people in poverty because they live in the wake of all of these things that are happening. And so, folks, the additional piece of this is that there is no reason why it's not, by the way, it's overwhelming the interest of everybody. If we end this gigantic division, bring people of poverty out of poverty, move them into a place where, in fact, they are able to compete, they get a fair shot, whether it's housing, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whatever it is, it benefits the whole nation. And we got to stop letting these guys use the divisions that exist in the country as a means, like charlatans always do, to divide the country. Well, the reason why that black man doesn't have a job in your county is because of that white immigrant coming across the border here, or that Hispanic, or that Muslim, or whatever. It's used by charlatans all the time. And we have a guy in the White House who's turned it into an art form. It has to end. It has to end. The division has to end, and we have to start talking about what we're going to do explicitly for each of these people. The environment's the first thing. Lastly, I agree with Jim Clyburn. He has a 10-20-30 program where he says that any county that in fact has been in poverty for 10 or more years should be the first place where any program that affects counties, the money should go first, in that order. We should start with the poorest and work our way to the wealthiest counties. And so I think that program would be instituted fully with me as President of the United States. I think it would be instituted fully with me as President of the United States.
And may I ask you, Mr. Vice President, just in follow-up, really to all of three of these questions, because what you've talked about are initiatives that would eventually have to wind up in the Senate. And you were in the Senate for quite a long time. You've experienced Mitch McConnell up close. He comes from a state that has substantial poverty, a southern state where you would think these kinds of programs would be both needed and popular, whether on the environment or whether on economics. He's dead set against them all. How would you get past either a majority Republican Senate in which Mitch McConnell was determined to kill all of these ideas, or even a Mitch McConnell in the minority who repeated the consistent filibustering that happened when you were vice president, and anything that came from the Obama-Biden administration, Mitch McConnell considered dead on arrival?
Joy, I know you're one of the ones that think it's naive to think we have to work together. The fact of the matter is, if we can't get a consensus, nothing happens except the abuse of power by the executive. Zero. Number one. Number two, there are certain things where it just takes a brass knuckle fight. There's no way to do it. What you do is when they say we're not going to support you, we do what I did last time. I went into 68 races in 22 states, and they were not blue states. They were not blue areas. And guess what? Remember I got criticized by a lot of you in the press saying we're going to win back the House, win over 40 votes? Well, we got 40 votes back, and we beat people who were, in fact, Republicans with mainstream Democratic people going in and saying, look, this is what they're doing to health care. This is what they're doing to... You have to go out and beat these folks if they don't agree with you, by making your case. And that's what presidents are supposed to do. Persuade the public. Move people as to what's going on. Last point I'll make. Remember with the Affordable Care Act, because everything landed on President Obama's desk but locust at the time, he had no time to explain the Affordable Care Act. Once it got started taken away, all of a sudden we have what we call in Southern Delaware an altar call from all those boys. An altar call saying, oh my God, I'm for health care. I don't want to take away pre-existing conditions. I want to make sure, etc. And so you go out and you beat them. You make the case. You make an explicit case, just like we did for the House. I think we can do the same thing for the Senate. Secondly, you got to make it clear to Republicans that you understand on some things there is a rationale for compromise. For example, when we did the Recovery Act, which the President, as you may remember, the State of the Union say, Joe will do the Recovery Act, $89 billion. And it was done without any waste or fraud, 2% waste, fraud, or abuse. What happened there? We didn't have the votes initially. So I went on, I changed 3 Republican votes. What you try to persuade. Doesn't mean you can do it all the time, but it kept us from going into depression. And so folks, look, if you start off with the notion there's nothing you can do, well, why don't you all go home then, man? Or let's start a real physical revolution if you're talking about it. Because we have to be able to change what we're doing within our system, because you talk about the creed. We the people, we hold these truths self-evident. We haven't always lived up to that standard, but we've never fully abandoned it. And the moment we abandon it, we lose everything we stand for nationally and internationally in terms of the power of our persuasion. The reason why the rest of the world follows us and we're secure is not because we have the largest military in the world. It's because we not only lead by the example of our power, but the power of our example. And you can shame people to do things the right way.
Bishop Barber has a question.
Yes, we prepare to end this section. One of the challenges that the Poor People's Campaign is bringing to everybody is that there's nobody that's not at blame. Republicans are at fault for the condition of the poor. Democrats. We have virtually eliminated the conversation about poverty and policies and the interlocking injustices. We keep wanting, for instance, most of the time when there's a conversation about racism, it wants to talk about cultural racism, not policy racism. And then there's not a connection to that and poverty and so forth and ecological devastation. So here's the question. In 2016, we had 26 presidential debates on the main stage, televised. Not one of them focused an hour on addressing the problems of 43.5% of this nation, 140 million poor and lower people. I didn't have this question at first, but as you continue to talk, and I think I'll ask it to everybody, will your campaign advocate for a complete debate on the issue of poverty in the United States of America?
Yes, and Reverend, that's why I'm here. That's why I'm here today. The notion of dealing with poverty in America is not only systemic, it is incredibly debilitating. It's the one thing that can bring this country down, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And if you take a look, my whole career, I've talked about poverty. That's what I got involved with. That's why I got started in the first place. It was about the injustices that exist not only in my state, as you know, you're probably one of the few people who has the 8th largest African American population in the country. But it was also a state in the southern part of the state where they talk with a great accent, and we couldn't make up our mind exactly which side they wanted to be in the Civil War. But there are a lot of poor folks down there. Those poor folks, what they call hanging chickens in the chicken industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and most of them are Caucasian. And so the point is, we got to make it clear to people that they're all in this together, but we don't do that very well. But my son Bo and I, before he died, he was the Attorney General, we're the only 2 Caucasian guys that won downstate, as they say, and won overwhelmingly in the black community, because I don't make a difference. I don't trim it. And you've been with me. You know that I don't trim it. And that's what it is, what it is. Let people know the truth. The American people, if they're exposed to the truth, and you go out and knock on their doors, you sit with them in their living rooms, you walk into the diners and make the case, they get it. They get it. And look, part of my dad had an expression, half a win is showing up, Rev. Just showing up. That's why I'm so proud of you. I'm presumptuous of me to say this, but I'm so proud of you. Look what you, no, all of this, but that's you started this. You organized this. You put this together.
We have just a little bit over a minute left. Can I ask, President Obama largely spoke those kinds of messages and was so compelling. Why do you suppose the other side did not hear it?
Well, look, they did hear. Here's what happened. Let's be honest with one another. When the President of the United States, my friend Barack Obama, was elected, it was the greatest honor in my life to serve with him. He's become a close friend. Here's the deal, though. The world was falling apart. The first year, he did everything just to keep us from going off a cliff, completely off a cliff. Done, finished, depression. And it took enormous amount of credit, enormous amount of capability for him to do it. Then he moved in and he made sure that we did something no other president has ever to do, the Affordable Care Act. And we did it without a single Republican vote. And in the process, it was hammer and tong fighting. At the same time, he went on, he tried to change our foreign policy and end our involvement in these wars. And he did it. He did it. And by and large, until things changed around and we made so many mistakes subsequently. So the point was, President Obama talked about these things, but the first thing first was, it didn't matter a whole lot, guess what, if in fact we were in absolute depression in the United States of America.
And that is your time. And the music didn't play. You guys have to sing it.